keep a reference of any kind of knowledge of Black history, because knowledge seeks knowledge. And obviously, by you being here, you have some idea of Black history and want to know more. Something piqued your interest. Our course, is there anyone also that did not receive a syllabus or course outline? Anyone did not receive that? All right, you got a chance to peruse, and you noticed pretty much what the things being offered each week are. Now, we'll take a vote hopefully tonight. Our third session, which is our museum trip to the Oriental Institute, University of Chicago, will take place either on a Saturday, and what I want you to do before you leave tonight is to think it over. It will be at noon on that Saturday or that Sunday. Now, the majority hopefully will rule in this instance, and I want you to think it over. It will be the question I ask you before you leave tonight, so we'll have 2 weeks to prepare for it. That ensuing Saturday or Sunday, as by your vote, will mean that you'll come here on a Thursday evening, and then we'll meet again either that coming Saturday or Sunday before our next class. That will be your third class, which is a in detail field trip to the University of Chicago. By that time, you'll be prepared for it. We'll give you pass also to what you expect to see, some questions you might want to raise, and so on like that. So please consider that, whether the Saturday or Sunday at noon would be better for you. Hopefully then the majority will rule, and if everything works out with the museum, which we've already begun to make arrangements for, we couldn't do too much until we knew how many were going to show up tonight, then that will be your third class. Are there any questions about the field trip and how it fits in with your third class that I just mentioned to you? We'll be getting more detail. Yes?
What's the date on the third class?
I don't have it. Okay, it would be the 11th would be our next Thursday.
Okay.
And then that would mean it would be what, the 13th?
Yeah, 13th.
Or 14th, depending again,
14th.
which you decide, which the majority you can come out for. Some people find Sunday a little bit more easier for it. It will take about an hour and a half, by the way. It doesn't take that long. It will be about an hour and a half. And some people find that time at Sunday a little bit more relaxing, but others will say Saturday. So I'm not going to argue with you. I'll go by the majority rule. Okay. So that would be probably the 13th. Okay. Most of us have been told that we come from Africa, that the black man's home is Africa, that in many cases 4004 BC marked the period of Adam and Eve's creation, and then the first man began to walk the earth. And if we're doing any kind of research, we say that the first man should have been black, simply because if supposedly black people are the oldest people on the face of the earth, and 4004 BC marks the advent of the Christian calendar of Adam and Eve's creation, then that's what you would have to be faced with, a black man, Adam and Eve. Fortunately or unfortunately, the modern archaeological diggings, the modern research, modern historians, scholars, since we fought now 3 major world wars and 5 skirmishes, and we're forever at each other's throats on other lands, and we're fighting for tariff duties, and we're fighting for indigenous products. Because of all of this, people have begun to talk more, circulate more, and mankind has seen mankind more, and the foolishness has got to stop. It's quite obviously that Adam and Eve was not created 4004 BC, because there's evidence now through Professor A.S.B. Leakey and A.R. Leakey, digging in Africa at Alamadugo Gorge, that have found artifacts and relics that now carbon date. And I do admit that carbon dating is not the best method, but it is the method that everything else is being dated by. And it can be all from 50 to 75 years, but no more. Carbon dating shows that they found there in a tertiary bed, meaning that they dug down to the ground, and after digging down to the ground at a level of strata or layer, which they carbon dated to be at least 65 to 75,000 years old, they found a nail. It was not just that it was a nail, but it was a cadmium nickel alloy nail. What does that mean? That means that if the carbon dating pulls up to within 75 years per se, that roughly some 65,000 years ago somebody needed a nail and made one. Since it is cadmium and nickel, it means that electrolysis or some type of smelting was used, which means also an invention of electricity and the ability to refine and confine ores and in shape them. That is intelligence. That was just the beginning of the mess. What they have now found is a crystal skull, which is almost impossible to carbonate this crystal skull. In fact, that it is so clear and made out of natural crystal quartz. They are saying that it is at least 150,000 years old, minimum. It could be forward with age, they say, much longer than that. And it shows that intelligent life somewhere on this planet not only could refine and grow or make to maturate natural crystal and shape it like a skull, but if any of you are into Christology, you understand to clear it like that is a faith within its own self. A perfectly clear crystal skull. Now, in diggings that we'll be talking about next week at a place called Ta-Seti, T-A-S-E-T-I, they have pushed man back to at least 500,000 BC with very intelligent life. The things that they have found we'll be talking about, and I'm sure it will raise eyebrows or possibly send you on research trips. And let me state at the very beginning of this, hopefully this course will not only give you inspiration to do more and more studies, possibly corroboration of some of your present studies, but will definitely open the doors and your nose to more and more in-depth studies about the history of our planet and definitely the history of what is called the people carrying melanin. Again, basic premise. We have been called, and I'm identifying now with the so-called Negroid race of people, and let me explain now the terminology. Anthropologically, they have classified mankind into three major groups. One, well, let me just ask you, okay, I don't have to use the board, maybe I should. I see some young ones present. Does anyone know what those major groups are? Okay, you all know. All right. Negroid, Caucasoid, and Montoid. Is there a need to put that on the board? Yes. Yes. And one yes, that makes it official. We've come to accept Negroid as what we call colloquially black, Caucasoid as colloquial white, and Mongoloid as colloquial yellow, with a red distinction being what they call Indian, now referred to as Native American because the Indians were, of course, never their names. And I lectured at the American Indian Center, and hopefully when we get to that part, maybe we can get a little Native American here. It's just awful that they don't even know who they are anymore. And we've all accepted nomenclatures, we've all accepted handles, we've all accepted names that have nothing to do with the truth of our past, simply branded, most mentally and sometimes physically, with names pulled out of a hat. That's just about how much logic that those names convey to the people entwined. Just as, for instance, we're going to take a trip to the Oriental Institute to find out about black history. Isn't that interesting? Going to the Oriental Institute to find out about black history. There are many Orientals to go to that museum and institute looking for themselves and leaving puzzled. Where was I? So the question becomes, why do they call it Oriental Institute? But we will look at that. Negroid then gets into different terminologies. Negro, colors, blacks. And there are people who do not like the term black, there are people who do not like the term Negro, there are people who do not like the term colors, and now the term is Afro-Americans. And as Lou Palmer says, which many of you listen to again, Africa's in America. Octoroons, Neptunes, Saracens. We have had all kinds of names for poor people who are are in the main, the majority in populace on earth, but just don't know who we are. For here, I'm going to use a phrase, and I'm going to interchange it with the word black, which I have no problem with, just as I have no problem with white. If there could be a white person, there must be a black person, and then we can colloquially say there's a red or a yellow person. I like to refer to those people who have a great deal of pigmentation, which means that they become very dark, all the way to those who have a little pigmentation, which means that they are light with some dark. As people carrying melanin, or melanin producers, melanin is the substance which makes a person dark of skin. And the more the abundance of melanin through the tissues, intradermal, epidermal, that is how dark that person gets. The ability of the body to produce into the intradermal tissue, and then later on secrete into the epidermal tissue, the substance called melanin. Melanin comes from the pineal gland. The pineal gland, a little gland that sits in the hypothalamus beneath what is called mainly the pituitary. And as the body is able to secrete that, the skin is able to darken. Tanning and freckles are simply results of the body's ability to produce some melanin under sunlight exposure, but not enough to make the person that color continuously, and the person reverts back upon the absence of sunlight and the need to secrete melanin. The production of melanin has also been found to enhance brain capacity, meaning that the neuron networks and neuron centers, the brain can fire more rapidly and at higher vibratory rates with the presence of melanin. Tissues that scar and need deepen what they call incrustations. And this is one of the banes of very dark-skinned people, because the scarring tissue leaves such a dark residue that it looks awful. But yet, the very presence of the substance that makes a person have deep scar tissue is what saves them from radiation poisoning and saves them from what we call deep neuroticism and psychoticisms because of the inability to take in radiation or sunlight and convert it. The whole process on this planet is photosynthesis, but that has not been taught in our schools. It is the ability of plants to take in light and produce a substance, which we call chlorophyll, and the ability of animals and humans to take in light and convert it into a substance that we call melanin. For anyone living in bands of radiation that we would find around the equator and to intense sunlight, it is a must to secrete melanin. And the more you're exposed to that type of sunlight, and hopefully do not become actinically or ultravioletly burned, you must secrete melanin. And thus comes many diseases that we talk about that are bane or malevolent to what we call Negroid people, and the tanning, which we're finding now is a blessing because of the pretty so-called brown color that comes about. As people have in their RNA, DNA chromosome structure, as they have mixed bloods, or the blood of the black man within their veins, they have sometimes freckles, and that's all a freckle is. Part of the skin trying to produce, and trying, I should say, to utilize the melanin secretion, but not being capable of doing it entirely throughout the epidermal or the outer layer of skin, and therefore they freckle. And you'll notice the freckles deepen under what? Sunlight. It speaks for itself. We have just gotten so unloved and so mixed up, we don't look at the obvious. And you may not agree with the obvious. That is your pleasure. People carrying melanin are found in every continent on this planet. The further you go back in the history of that continent, and let me repeat that slowly. There is no place on earth where people live that if you check the history of it and the migration patterns, how they got there, where they came from, that did not first produce a black man on that very spot. Now, that's a heck of a statement to make, and I'll hold it until you can correct me down the line or later on when we turn it over for questions and comments, even tonight. Therefore, if you research the history of any continent, my claim is that you will find Negroid people. Negroid only by the term that the anthropologists are using. And since we're trying to be intelligent here and we're trying to look at our history, we'll take those names, but understand that those names don't necessarily bind you They're just names to use while in Rome. The whole idea is people carrying melanin in spite or despite or with despite of whatever you call it have been found wherever you go back in those histories. Just briefly, when you look at the continent of Australia, supposedly there's a big question mark there. How in the world did the Aborigines, unique as they are, ever get to Australia? No one can understand. Oh, what a mystery. Oh. Here is a dark-skinned, blonde-haired people in many cases, straight black hair, going back for 5 and 6 now generations like this. How in the world did black people ever get naturally golden hair? And where did these wide-nostril, straight-haired people come from? It is not the question, where did these wide-nosed, big-lipped, Negroid peoples come from? It was, who interrupted their lifestyle to impregnate them with blonde hair? That is your question, not the question where they come from. I go back to my basic tenet and premise, which is, again, any continent you go to, the original people that you will find there, if you go back far enough in their history, are dark-skinned people. In fact, the name for them is Negrito. I didn't say Negro. What did I say?
Negrito.
Negritos are generally what we call diminutive, meaning that they're very slight built and usually short. Slight built. Long-headed, which they refer to as occipital lobe, means the back of the head is longer than the front of the head, and usually kind of a rounded forehead individual. Dark-skinned. A Negrito is short, thin, long-headed, and dark. Short, thin, long-headed, and dark. Short, thin, long-headed, and dark. These are called Negritos. Anywhere you go back in history, on any land, that's what you're going to finally come up with as an ancestor of most people. I know that raises lots of questions. We're just beginning. We're just beginning. In Australia, you had convicts from Europe, especially what they call the Balkan states, and later on the area that they called Germany, which has had many names, Russia, so on and so forth again. There were convicts who escaped a sinking galley on the high seas and rowed to Australia. And then later on, as the message got out, people who were mercenaries and the worst scum of Europe that came to Australia. The Australians were hybrid people, the worst lot of Europe, just as the first settlers in America that came from Europe were from Newgate and Marshalsea prisons and debtors' prisons and mercenaries and zealots and so on and so forth. The worst came out because the best stayed where their homes and factories and lands and money was. Okay? When these sailors and mercenaries came to Australia, Australia teemed with people. And they began to systematically annihilate those people that they found there, which were dark-skinned. Those were the native Australians. In fact, we'll get into shortly the real name for Australia. You will note, too, as I give tidbits to whet your appetite at our beginning classes, that all of the continents, topographically speaking, begin and end with the letter A. All of the continents begin and end with the letter A, and they say that there are 7. That is not true, but they've been telling you that there are 7. The only one that does not begin and end with the letter A is not a continent. And what continent is that? Europe is not a continent. If you look at it, it is at best an annexation or peninsula of Asia. Okay, that's all it is. All the rest of them begin and end with the letter A. And Europe is the most recently named. When we get into some later classes, I'll explain to you how Europe got its name, and you'll be amazed, or some of you may know and won't be amazed, but most of you will. And as I stated, it's not even a continent. Those people on Australia, going back to the original thought, who killed off the native Australians, again, did so in a very unique method. The biggest thing that the Negroid person on this planet recently has suffered through is the lack of gunpowder and things to fight gunpowder. Okay? Gunpowder blows you up, missiles you, knives and spears only go so far. But they used a very unique weapon on Australia. It was not gunpowder because the people were so numerous that wasn't even getting the job done. Australia has what they call outbacks, and it is so built with topography that the highlands are backcountry, and then they flow down to the ocean. It is a hilly climb, and then it drops out back, and then they have what we would call jungle forestry areas. They're cross between the Everglades and the forest there. The waters start at the height and flow down toward their natural level, the sea, and what they did was to go to the height and poison the water holes. And as the water on the surface and even underground water began to trickle, the poison infested most of the water supply, and people dropped like flies. They died dead due to poison. Those that escaped the gunpowder and the poisoning fled upland and then outback. Many of the women, as is known when men act in subcultures and men act in heinous fashions, they were raped and impregnated repeatedly, and those that escaped with their lives, most of the time they didn't kill them, bore the babies of those who did the deed, and that's where your blonde-haired Aborigines come from. There were many, of course, who had black hair, and they bore straight-haired babies. But understand one other thing. Many of the so-called native Australians, or Negritos, already had straight black hair. It is we who feel that all black people, or Negroid people, that come from Africa have what they call peppercorn, kinky, nappy, or tight curly hair. That is not true. There was a whole strain or race of people on Earth that was dark with very straight hair. This had nothing to do with miscegenation or rape. This is another misnomer, and something that we will find very interesting as we begin to look at what we call the table of nations. At this point, I'd like to jump to what is called speculative history, and we'll spend about 12 minutes with it, if you don't mind. Speculative history is just this. It is history that there is speculation about. Your guess is as good as mine. It supposedly cannot be proven, this history. Therefore, I separate it from the chronological and written history, whether it's accepted or not. And that is the thought of lost continents. The idea that there may have been on Earth places that once were on the surface that now, because of cataclysms and faults and quakes and possibly even an overturn of our planet that many are beginning to believe, these lands disappeared and the people indigenous upon them also disappeared. I want to deal with the idea, first of all, that most of you have heard about Atlantis, the lost continent. And this must come up in any basic good history lesson because more and more now, so-called learned scholars and men, women, researchers are beginning to think that this is a very distinct possibility that there were lost continents, and one was called Atlantis. Briefly, the story started supposedly with a man by the name of Plato, a Greek, who learned this from his his uncle called Solon, who stated that he learned this from some of the priests of Memphis, in other words, in Egypt, who this story had been told to them for time on, and that it has even been written in some of the pyramids and on some of the tablets. In fact, it's been stated that amongst the Qumran scrolls, and even written on the Rosetta Stone, was an idea of a landmass that broke up, scattering its people over the earth. Russia, over the last 5 years, has done extensive research in both the Baltic and off the coast of the Mediterranean leading out to what they call the Atlantic Ocean, and they have claimed that below Greenland and leading for almost 4,000 miles there is residue on the ocean bottom that shows, indeed, that the configurations of a city or massive groups of cities or landmass fell from the waters of the ocean and down to the ocean bottom there. They found colonnading, they found steps, and if you check most topographical maps that show all of the natural features of the Earth, you'll find that they call it the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, that there is a big fjord, a big fissure, a big rift, a big bend, a big hole, long trench that is at the bottom, almost midway in the Atlantic, by which it seems the Earth opened up and closed, and who knows what it closed upon, and obviously the tidal waves and inundations that came when that happened must have wreaked havoc on all surface lands. There are patterns, of course, by many saying that you can find fossil remains and flora, meaning animal and wildlife and plant life, that resemble off of our east coast much of the west coast of Africa. In checking that closely, that holds true in some cases. In other cases, that is simply a dream, because in many cases that continent, even its elevation is much different from ours. But there's still a belief in that, and so be it if you wish to pursue that course. But along the ocean bottoms and on many of the Atlantic islands, there are things that do resemble tropical islands, more so than what we would call our normal east coast of the Americas. The Atlantis statement was that there were a people there. In fact, that there were three kinds of people there. A very short red people, a very tall white people, and a kind of a brown-skinned intermixture, which they stated was more animal than human. And these very tall white people had an advanced civilization, using crystals and magnets, and that they were able to fly in the air, that they were able to float on the waters, and even had submarines and used telepathic communication. Oh boy, it sounds like a utopia or some kind of advanced civilization from another planet. These are all the stories and legends of Atlantis. They even had beasts that we supposedly call now prehistoric beasts that lived in one part of the land. And that through the use of frequency modulations and crystals, they so got out of tune that nature rebelled upon them. And one of the abominations supposedly that happened on Atlantis was that they began to use genetic research, having this ability through magnetic frequencies to break what they call the basic chromosome pattern and go into any cell wall. They were able to infuse whatever they wanted to within the nucleus, and they made anything that they wanted to on all atoms, caring not for what was called the creator's plan or anything else. And that they made people, and they engrafted these people with animals, and they mated animals with plants, and they crossed anything that they chose, and these creatures began to survive after Atlantis went down, because the phenomena of which many of them they made were amphibious creatures, or what we would call now, I guess, creatures from the Black Lagoon, or fish people. The old stories of mermen and mermaids and sirens are based on the legends of Atlantis, once Atlantis sunk, and these were the creatures who had no land, but then were adrift on the seas to go on islands and outcroppings and things like this. This is the whole story of Atlantis. And that, in the latter days of Atlantis, it supposedly took a brief period of time, some 3.5 years, for Atlantis to go down once it began to break up, that many of his people fled, but most of the scientists who chose to stay with the land until the last were drowned. And that the people who spread from there went to Africa, partially to India, and partially rejoining a colony of people in what we would now call South America. That is definitely a brief overview, but those stories and what happened can be found in books by Ignatius Donnelly, in books by a church ward called The Lost Cities of New, and so on like this, what they call the church ward folios. Church ward. One of those is listed on your bibliographic or your book outline. It's called The Children of Mu. I think it's misspelled Mu there, but it's supposed to be Mu. The other concept, and I'll put this on the board for my criticism overview, is that there was another, oh, by the way, Atlantis supposedly broke up, and the last parts of it broke up about 12,500 BC. and that it took some 3.5 years to do so, but that it was degenerating or breaking up over a longer period of time because in having taken up most of the Atlantic Ocean at one time, when it broke up, it took up only a fraction of its part. This is the story of Atlantis that took some 75,000 years to finally go down, breaking up over 3.5 years period of time. The other hypothesis, or the other speculation, is what is called the story of Mu. Mu is also known as Lemuria. And the epic of Lemuria is one that this landmass existed in the Pacific Ocean. Just briefly, we're getting a picture that looks something like this now. We're going to put the United States here since we're most understanding of that in the Gulf of California and Florida. Here we had what we call Atlantis. And of course here we had Africa. And as it broke up and the people journeyed mainly down here to what we would call South America, and over to India and into parts of Africa, we now are talking about a landmass now in the Pacific Ocean shaped somewhere like this. It's not quite more elongated here. Similar to this, as this we call Atlantis, this we would call now Mu, or later on Lemuria, Lemuria, Lemuria. That speculation is that Lemuria was the largest natural landmass the Earth ever had, and took up almost, shall we say, 3/4 of the Earth. They stated that it existed anywhere from 275,000 to almost 1 million years ago, so large it was and so long it took to break up. One phenomenon we find in the Pacific Ocean is what is called Easter Island. How many are familiar with Easter Island? Okay. Then you know that that is where they have some 593 statues of ex-President Nixon. Now, why do I say that? Of course, I shouldn't sort it like that because somebody's going to quote me now and say that that's where they have statues of Nixon. That may not be too ludicrous. These statues look like a profile of Nixon if you ever see him sideways profile. At least it resembles it to me. These statues are said to be one of the curiosities and inexplicables of nature and of our planet, simply because they are made, in many cases, from stones not indigenous, naturally found on that island. The island itself has never had over 3,000 people, and they feel that when they were carved, there were over 350 people, and they're monumental in weight. Many of them weigh up to 32 tons. Why do I mention this? Because there it sits, some 1,500 miles off the western coast of Chile, with nothing around it, and they can't understand how did it get there? Why would anyone want to do that much work on that? Well, if we go with a theory, a concept, a speculative idea that these represent the vestiges, the last remains of a continent that broke up, then we can begin to see that maybe they have some carvings and things going on at that tip, whether we're going to take these statues someplace else. And then when the calamity was started, kind of broke up. On Mu were said to be very dark little people in the main, and a red race, and near the last 100 years of it, a white race, but a white race much different than the one that we now call Caucasoid or Caucasian, supposedly from the Caucasus. And that these people that were red and black were the first creations of Earth, one having gone through a process of evolution and the other having been, and I guess I have to use the word this way, dropped off. And then later on was dropped off the white race there, which became the more fighting race, the technological race, which they've always been since their interest to Earth, which has been a puzzle to most archaeologists and researchers. Even those who bear white skins now, has not been where did the black man come from. The real question has been where did the white man come from. Here it does not even answer that because it still states that even here that he was not indigenous, but much different than we find now. And there are all types of stories about blues, that the blue whites were very extremely, and the black race of people long as individuals, and again, short, not tall, and that they were very psychic, and that they had an advanced society, but based on very spiritual means, and that the original pyramids were created here, and to go on with all the same story, because this is what you'll find in most of those books, either by Rudolf Serb or by Church Ward, and so that they even were capable of magnetic flight, and that they flew in the air through the use of magnetic energies, and so on like this. Now these things must be talked about, even though they're normally skipped over, because without that, you don't understand some of the pieces of the puzzle that the Russian scientists, that the American scientists are now trying to put together, which leads to that kind of speculation. And again, I quote you the books. Again, if you wish to go into that phase of it, please do so in your speculative look at history. As it broke up, it was stated that there were those who had been warned about this and proceeded to leave that continent and go to what we now call South America. The area at this particular time here was called Encalia. And I know if you use that word where you learned it from, because not too many people even heard of it again. The area over there past Africa and what we call Europe was called Urigar. And this was called Incal. And that they proceeded into this because at this time what we now call the Amazon swamp was actually an active river which connected both of these oceans, and understand at this time there was more land mass than ocean. Now, of course, it's just reversed. 3/4 water to 1/4 land, but at this time, obviously, if all of these things were there, there was more land than water. And that they set up colonies here in cities, and then they journeyed avoiding Atlantis because many of the ones that had caused the problems here had fled to this area, but around what they call India, and around to which they call now South Africa. It is generally thought by historians that the migration patterns, as I skip a little bit on Africa, has been from the north to the south. That the people started around the Mediterranean and in North Africa, what we now call, of course, Morocco and Libya and so on like this, Egypt, and then migrated their patterns southward. But in this instance, they're saying it was just reversed, that they migrated their patterns from India and from the tip down there, and then moved upward, what we would now call a place of City of Stone, I can't think of it right now, Zimbabwe, and moved upward. Whichever we'll see as we get into what we call our real history in the weeks to come. But this sets the stage for what was called speculative history. Now, yes, I understand there's much more detail, and there's going to be much more detail on many of the things that we're talking about. Otherwise, we could stay here 2 years for a course in black history. I'm giving you an overview, research patterns, and books that you might refer to. Okay? Before we go further into what I want to call the original and needs of creation, I'd like to open up, since we've covered now a lot of territory, for your comments, questions, and so on. Let's not take more than about 8 to 10 minutes if there are that many, but I think before we even now get into a heavier portion or another portion that I should ask to exchange with you. Are there comments or questions? So, yes, I see the ladies there. Okay, what point was I trying to make? I posed a question of myself. I didn't give you a chance to do it. Many questions have been raised about what is called the Australian Aborigines. It's like you would ask now, where did the Africans come from in view of the Afrikaners? Are you following my logic here? Okay. I pose that because I state that the solution to that question may be the solution to many other questions on the same or semblance. That it is not where did the native Aborigines come from, but where did the force of people that made them begin to be atypical, look different than what they had been for years, come from. The native Australians, my premise is, were dark-skinned anyway. And these were babies through rape and through mating from a people new to the land. Explaining, you see, because they have accepted somewhat the straight hair, black hair, but not quite with the blonde hair. That is one premise that I was offering at the beginning. Okay. I saw the ladies hand there, and I saw the gentleman. Yes.
Okay. You stated that the Earth, that they found the Earth to be older than it was first thought to be. Okay. Another class, I was told that when men landed on the moon, they expected a certain amount of moon dust because the Earth was supposed to be so old. But when the men stepped off on the moon, they found out the dust wasn't that deep, so therefore they said that the Earth was not then as old as had been first speculated 150,000 years. It was only about 4,000 years old because of the small amount of moon dust that was on the moon.
That's interesting. With Apollo 13, when some of the first rock samples were brought back, however, there was a Gemini landing, which people seem to forgot about, which also supposedly scooped up some dust and rocks, which were on view at the Museum of Science and Industry, and later on at the Smithsonian. But the rock samples that were brought by 13 and 15, those probes, have dated, well, let me first give this. They say that the Earth is 4.6 to 5.6 million years old. 4.6 to 5.6. Now, that's a lot of discrepancy, but that's the way they use the terms. Don't fault me. Read look it up. They found that these moon rock samples, now please hear the difference, were from 6.5 to 7.5 million years old. Okay? That meant that the moon rock samples carbon dated older than the Earth rock samples. So much for the hypothesis for some then that the moon came from the Earth and that's why the Pacific Ocean is there. They have stated, with recent logistics on the Apollo series, whatever you think of it, that the moon rock samples were older than the Earth rock samples.